Welcome to Dynamos Dozen, the podcast that I bring you each and every single week, where I talk about whatever may be on my mind, from pro wrestling, sports, entertainment, music, movies, muesli, fresh socks and jocks, and everything in between, never forgetting the talk. And today, once again, we're talking in the world of mysteries, because I am joined by the host of what has become one of my favorite podcasts, Mr. Paul Bestall from Mysteries and Monsters, an amazing podcast that is available anywhere you listen to your favorite audio, also available on Patreon, which Paul will go through momentarily. He covers the world of the weird and the wonderful, mainly, I suppose, with lake monsters, Sasquatch, dogman UFOs, all that kind of stuff, but nothing is out of bounds with this man, that's for sure. And Paul, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the show, sir.
No, well, thank you, Ian. And as I said, whilst we were briefly chatting, thank you very much for the invitation. It's very kind, and you were very kind about me there. So it is graciously appreciated. Thank you.
Absolutely. You have had you've had some amazing guests on your show. Actually, some of my favorite people. Of course, Ron Moorhead, who I've had on the show recently enough as well. Had a lot of good things to say about you as well. A man with a deeper voice than me, as I said to him on the show. I was like, dude, you gotta have a radio show nonstop so I can just fall asleep.
Oh yeah, not it's in like a bad Liquid way. Velvet.
Yeah, like not in a bad way, you know. He's just gonna read you your favorite bedtime stories, right?
Oh, yeah, it's fabulous. I could listen to Ron talk all day. I know exactly what you mean.
Absolutely. We followed him up with Todd Standen, by the way, which we can have a conversation with later, because a lot of controversy around around Todd, should I say, but been super nice to me and quite an interesting guy as well. And, you know, a lot of people may think he's probably a bit crazy or whatever, but he's got what could be some of the best evidence of Sasquatch out there too. So it's a very, very interesting subject. I'm sure we'll get onto that. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and about the show, and tell my listeners how they can find you and what it's all about?
Yeah, so Mysteries and Monsters is essentially a conversational show where I have the best and the brightest from around the world discussing a variety of topics. And as you referred to earlier, we do a lot on cryptozoology. So we've done Bigfoot, lake monsters, strange winged creatures, curious cryptids from around the world. We've done UFOs, done a lot of ghosts, alien abductions. So we've kind of covered most topics. We've done a bit of weird history, strange artifacts. So there's not many topics I've not delved into. So it's basically just gives me a chance to speak to some of my favorite authors and investigators from around the world, and that just makes my job very easy, really. So it's been going about 2.5 years. I just decided to start it as a one-man show, which it is essentially is just me. After sort of mulling it over for the best part of a year previous to joining it, and it's just grown from strength to strength in that period. And next week we hit our 150th episode, which is quite remarkable, really.
Awesome. It's nice when you kind of break that little kind of barrier for yourself, those little small goals that you set out for yourself, and you kind of start breaking them bit by bit. You kind of got to give yourself a little pat on the back, right? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I started, I was hoping to get to 25. So I think we've certainly surpassed that by now.
Absolutely. We kind of said we would wing it today because we're both very interested in the world of ufology and Sasquatch. They'd be my two big ones, purely because I think they're the two that have a lot of weight to them. A lot of people will say, oh, well, the Mothman or the Dogman or the Jersey Devil or any of that kind of stuff, they'll kind of go, all right, you're stretching it a bit for me now, but it's still interesting conversation, right? Same with lake monsters. I mean, Nessie and of course Champ from Lake Champlain, and that one is actually probably even more intriguing than Nessie, to be fair. Because it's a bigger location and quite the sightings that have been seen over there. But I said we'd start off because you kind of have some UFO stories and stuff like that that are particular favorites of yours that you kind of wanted to bring up on the show. And to be honest with you, it's one of my favorite subjects. It's captivated me since I was knee high to a grasshopper. So why don't you take the reins from me here?
Yeah, well, I suppose being a Yorkshireman, Ian, it would be amiss of me for not to start with probably one of my favourite UK ones, which is the incident that affected PC Alan Godfrey in November 1980, which has always been a very interesting case. Alan's always been a very credible person. I mean, he's 73 now. Mm-hmm. So he's spent over half of his life sort of discussing this strange incident that occurred to him. And it is one of those things that when I've started doing the show, I've started going on little pilgrimages around the UK. So I have been to Todmorden and stood where Alan had his encounter on that road on that night at, I think it was about 5 a.m. And he'd been sent out because there'd been a number of calls in regards to a herd of loose cows wandering around the town, causing old people problems and eating flowers and hedgerows and things like that. So,
and this isn't drunk old women, by the way. We're talking about literal cows.
Yeah. So it was basically just a very mundane, rural northern town incident, as often would involve cows of some description, I would suggest.
Sure. Yeah.
Especially late at night at that time. So Alan was just going round, and it was I think it was his last thing he was going to do before finishing the night shift and going home. And as he was driving around looking for these cows, which strangely enough, there is a strange end note to that part of the story. As he was driving around, he passed the local bus that was picking people up on the way to work and drove off. Yeah. And as he was coming down the road, this ball of light just appeared in front of him, spinning around and around. And he was shocked. He didn't know what was going on. And as often happens in UFO encounters, tried his radio, was dead. The car wouldn't start. So he got out his little police notebook, sketched what it was, and it's kind of like a horizontal diamond shape that he drew at the time. And then the next thing, he's 50 yards down the road, and he's like, oh, what's gone on there? And he'd lost between 25 minutes and 30 and half an hour. And he couldn't place what had happened to him, and he was all a bit befuddled by it.
Of course.
And that, I suppose, starts probably Yorkshire's most infamous UFO encounter.
It's crazy, isn't it? Because we've heard some of the cases, obviously, around. We always think of the ones that have happened in the States, or obviously the one that happened in the UK also at the army barracks, the famous encounter.
That Rendlesham.
Yeah, but there's so many stories from the likes of Chile and Mexico, especially in South America and Bolivia, and you hear people of losing like 3 and 4 hours of time, and then you hear people losing like maybe 10 minutes of time and going, I just saw something and now I'm here, like what's happening. So that's kind of one of those situations, and I'm sure the officer probably thought to himself, like, am I losing my mind here? What's going on? You know what I mean? Just going out to fix a bunch of cows, and all of a sudden you see this kind of crazy ball of light standing in front of you. And I mean, it was, so he remembered exactly what he saw, but then he couldn't obviously remember the aftermath, what happened in between.
Yeah, that was it. That basically, and that's what kind of set it all off from the normal explanations, really. And going back to the cows as well, the cows were discovered later that morning inside a locked field, but nobody knew. The cows couldn't have jumped in, they couldn't have got in, it was completely locked. So they were just found inside I think they were inside a rugby pitch.
Wow.
And the gate was locked, it was padlocked, and there was no way for the cows to have got in unless one of them had a key, which we all know, cows are not known for their safe breaking abilities.
No.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what went on, but that was always one of the weird little things about that story that often gets overlooked, is the fact that the cows were found inside a locked playing field, which they couldn't have got in unless they were dropped in, it would seem.
Yeah, absolutely. Any kind of other strange ones, or do we want to touch on some of the more famous ones, because you've obviously talked to a lot of people that would have had experience with the likes of Roswell, for example. And I'm sure a lot of my listeners do enjoy, the downloads and the views that we get are generally show that a lot of people kind of sneak in to watch a show because it's not pro wrestling, but they see UFO or they see something a little bit weird and they go, okay, I'm going to stop by to watch that. You've talked to a number of people on the Roswell incident, and that's kind of the one. I mean, it's the biggest. It's the coup de grace, right? What's
it
your
is
thoughts
remarkable.
on that?
Just it's remarkable, Ian, because I find it. As much as I love this subject, I find it remarkable that there is still such a real appetite for something that happened
the 40s,
74 years ago. It was beginning of July 1947. But I think it's that kind of golden age of the UFO, late 40s, early 50s, when according to American newspapers and reporters, they were everywhere. The skies above the US were awash with alien visitations, and Roswell, I think, is one of those because it kind of encapsulates conspiracies, government cover-ups, crashed aliens being recovered, people being forced to change their stories, claims of coffins being made for little aliens. And it's a strange one, Roswell, because it had a massive kind of explosion at the time for sort of 2 or 3 days, because it obviously hit the newspapers, and the famous US Air Force recovers crash saucer. And then within 48 hours, it was like, oh no, it's not, it's just a weather balloon. And it disappeared for, I think, 30 years. And then obviously the much missed Stanton Freeman was kind of digging into it in the 70s, and he was given Jesse Marcel's contact details and rang him up. And Jesse Marcel said, I've carried this for 30 years. I can't hold it in anymore. And that's when it basically broke, which was sort of 1977, 1978. And that's when it kind of reappeared. And as ufology kind of trickled along through the 1980s, and we had a couple of other big ones, Roswell just started to grow and grow and grow. And then, as with most things in the 90s, Ian, the X-Files kind of just lit, touch paper under it. And, mid 90s, everybody knew about Roswell. So
that's kind of my era. I was born in 84. So early to mid 90s, you remember, obviously we had the same newspapers as you guys in the UK over in Ireland as well. And you remember you used to get those little books with them sometimes?
Yes. Yeah.
And they would have like the, conspiracy theories or unsolved mysteries and stuff. You'd have like a picture of a guy in Graceland in the west wing of Elvis's house, where it's like nobody's allowed in there. That's got to be him. And you were kind of like, whoa, this is intriguing. But then, of course, we had the film, the Roswell movie as well, in the early 90s, especially, and they put a lot of emphasis on the metal, the piece of metal that was recovered, and obviously in one of the local shops, which I heard on your podcast.
That was, I to be honest, Ian, I'd never heard of that report, and speaking with it was really interesting, because once again, it's one of those things, because as I was discussing on that particular episode, I think there's now just over 600 people who have come forward with a connection or a witness, or were there or saw something over the years, which is remarkable. It's one of those things where, because I think it plays into that whole conspiracy mindset as well, of massive cover-ups, and in those days, if the government told you to do something, most people did it. Otherwise, you may
not much has changed.
You may disappear, or be told that you've gone to work in Canada or something, and nobody ever sees you again. That old one. Or he's been transferred to Manitoba or something. So it's remarkable how that kind of plays into it all still. And the fact that obviously the US government covered it up for years, and then in the 90s they came out and said, well, actually what we said then wasn't true, it was this. And then everybody's like, well, hang on a minute. So you've admitted you lied then, so why do you expect us to believe it now? So it's kind of carried on playing it. And then obviously what's been happening over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, Ian, as well, with the Tic Tac videos and
Oh,
ATIP coming
especially even
forwards.
recently. Even recently, I was looking on Fox News, Tucker Carlson. I'm not usually a
Yeah.
fan of Fox News, but I do like Tucker Carlson because he always has kind of strange kind of guests on and kind of they cover that subject. Like they're openly talking about it now as if like this is a thing, and it's kind of like they drip feed you bits, but I do think we're the closest probably now in our lifetime to kind of it's basically known. One thing before we leave the Roswell subject,
Yeah.
somebody that I think gets overlooked a lot, because they tried to discredit him, is of course the great Colonel Philip J. Corso, who wrote the book The Day After Roswell. And I mean,
Yeah.
this is a guy who has every credential on the planet. I mean, anything that you could have within the military, this guy had.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm sure you've seen his son is kind of carrying on his legacy a little bit, and
Yeah.
you know, talked about seeing these things in caves, and you know, seeing exactly what he had to take back to. What was it? He had to. He was the head of one of the heads of the recovery mission, so he had to bring the containers from, you know, A to B. And he saw them. He said they just look like little children, and he goes, and that's pretty much the you know, the gray alien, as we like to think. That's what he saw. So I mean, it's that's an amazing book for anybody that wants to read it and like go into it and think it's a crock of shit if you want, but it's a great read anyway. For me, you know, it's very hard to find someone more credible than someone like that. And especially he wanted to lift the lid as he knew he was kind of in his latter years, and he's like, I just want people to know this is legit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Jesse Marcel, often people are quite dismissive about Marcel, but
sure,
people forget he was a major. You know, this was a guy that had got an outstanding military CV. He was well respected. He'd had some very high profile posts during the Second World War. You know, it wasn't just some private pretending to you know, chasing the fame. And obviously, you've got to remember as well, UFOs weren't cool then when this all happened. You know, the Kenneth Arnold incident had happened about a week, 2 weeks beforehand, and then it just all blew up from that point onwards. So you had like two of the main events in modern UFO history happening within a couple of weeks of each other. So I think often when we look back at things like that, Ian, people sometimes think, oh, well, they're doing it for the publicity or they wanted the celebrity. But it was a completely unknown subject. People just didn't talk about it. And as we've seen in many witnesses across a variety of phenomena, coming forwards is often you know, a death sentence for any career or to be taken seriously by anybody. Because if people want to put you in that box of being a bit out there or untrustworthy or a fantasist, then people would have their lives destroyed. So it's easy to look at it in a modern context and miss just how groundbreaking that all was at the time. And plus the fact people go, oh, well, Marcel didn't know where he was looking at. He was a major. I'm pretty sure he know what a weather balloon looked like.
But I mean, you look at the people that they have tried to discredit over the course of that time. I mean, one that really kind of stands out to me is, of course, what's his name? Area 51.
Bob Lazar.
Bob Lazar. I mean,
yes.
I mean, I'm sure everybody's watched his episode with on Joe Rogan's show and watched his documentary. Things now are coming out that they have found that he was talking about in the 70s and 80s. You know, when he first, you know what I mean, that he saw what he was working there in the 70s and 80s. He was able to literally draw diagrams of all this stuff, and this guy is absolutely credible. And it's kind of, but he was, you know, they said he never went to this college, he never did this, he, you know, and you're looking at his documentary and he's basically making these things right in front of you. You're like, what? So
I mean, he does. Lazar's a very interesting case, Ian, because you know, every time he's one of those things. It's like Bigfoot for me, because every now and again I'll get doubts and I'll think,
don't get doubts.
No, I know, but you've got to be balanced sometimes. And
no, you do.
And Bob Lazar's a bit like that, where you sometimes think, is it what it really is? And then he'll say something, or he'll do something, or as you say, he will clearly demonstrate a scientific knowledge that is far beyond the average person.
Yes.
And you just think, well, I mean, I honestly don't know. I'm one of those people, and I'm not one for sitting on the fence usually, but he is one of those things. I can't categorically tell you one way or the other, Ian, whether he is 100% bona fide or he is an incredible fantasist.
And it's kind of,
and if he is, he's one of the best that's ever been out there.
I was going to say that kind of lends itself to how good a job was done on discrediting him from the get-go, or how good an imagination has he got, you know what I mean? So I'm with you on that, you know what I mean? I think the likes of Dr. Stephen Greer and stuff, like, I don't know about this guy, you know what I mean? I think he's a little bit about that, because, when I hear, oh, well, and plus this is our show, I can say what I want about anybody in the show. I don't give a shit about Dr. Stephen Greer one way or the other. But, when I first started watching the likes of him, I was like, nah, I don't know. And it's like, everything, we've got the groundbreaking evidence, and then you're watching his documentaries and you're like, well, you've got nothing. You've got nothing that I can't find on your podcast, or on somebody else, Beyond the Skies or Somewhere in the Skies. You've got nothing different, and a lot of people do try and make money off it. Then one last person that we'll talk about in the UFO world, of course, which a lot of the flat earthers try to claim as one of their own, of course, was Admiral Byrd, who is probably literally one of the most credible sources of any information in the history of American, military, and especially pilots, like the number one pilot probably in US history for the time, and talks about going over the Antarctica and, seeing a life beyond the Antarctica and stuff, and obviously saying that it was something to do with kind of an alien life force and stuff, and was brought in. And he wasn't talking about little greys. I think he was talking about the Nordics, I think, wasn't it? Or the Nords they call. But I mean, this guy, really difficult to discredit this guy, other than just saying, oh, well, he got dementia on his last day of work,
Yeah. I mean, it is, I think it's very interesting that it's peculiar that there's only been so many up until fairly recently, Ian, who have been brave enough or had the balls to kind of stand up and say, well, I don't really care what happens to me. I'm just going to tell you what it is. And it is really interesting when you come across people like that. And it more so probably in the 70s and 80s, they kind of seemed to completely disappear off the map. There was nobody official, shall we say, and I hate using rabbit ears, official coming forwards to kind of say, oh, well, I've got experience about this. It seemed to completely be suppressed or whatever. I don't know what was going on. But you had several people, so at the 50s and 60s, like we said, and Byrd's another one who kind of just went, well, I don't give a damn what anybody thinks. I'm going to tell you what I know. I'm going to tell you what I've seen. It's real. This is going on. And they just don't want you to know about it. And it is one of those things, because I think if we've learned anything in the last 2 years, people just won't believe a lot of things unless they, unless they either suffer from something or they see it with their own eyes, and they just don't believe it. And it's remarkable that we seem to have got to this point where sometimes the truth just doesn't matter anymore. And I think it's interesting when we look at that in a cultural context about how it is now to compare to how it was then. Clearly, there was a lot of sort of black ops and suppression going on. Prime example of that, as we say before we wrap up UFOs, is that the American government had consistently said, after they shut Project Blue Book down, they had zero interest in collating, reporting, saving any UFO reports. We now know that that's complete nonsense, that they continued to collect them to the point that they realized that something else was going on, and that's why ATIP was then set up as the latest incarnation of whatever. So when you go back to them telling us that Roswell was a weather balloon, you think, well, why should we believe people that have consistently lied about this subject for the best part of 80 years?
And everything, like, this is what people forget about the American government. I mean, they basically, they lied about Vietnam. They lied about weapons of mass destruction. Like, there is no end to what they can kind of make you believe. And then, as you say, people fall back in line, and then they wait for confirmation from their superiors. I hate doing rabbit ears too. And then when they get told it's true, it's like, oh, really? What's going on? But no, I do agree. What would you like to cover next? Would you like to chat a bit about lake monsters, or would you want to go straight into Sasquatch, Bigfoot?
Hey, you're the host.
You're the guest,
so
you're the guest. So I'll let you pick. You wanna tell a couple of lake monster stories or anything that you've heard from some of your interesting guests? Because for me, it's something that I haven't really looked at since I was a kid, and I don't mean that to sound condescending in any way, shape, or form, but it's something I've revisited it listening on your show. So, the spooks from the dead.
No problems. Yeah, I mean, the thing, like you said earlier, Champ's probably my favorite.
Yeah,
because it's such a big body of water, you know, and I think often the problem with the perception of lake monsters is everybody still thinks it's dinosaurs, you know, because of that picture of Nessie and everything.
Yeah, and obviously I've got, is that right?
Yeah. So a lot of them, they kind of look at it and go, well, it can't be true because it can't be a dinosaur. But I think when we look at it now, I think a lot of people, and I've got an episode coming up about Champ, actually, a new one.
Awesome.
That'll be out next month with Kate Elizabeth, who is out every day near enough on Lake Champlain with her sonar and her radar and her cameras checking out things. So it's very interesting for me when you're dealing with places like that. It's like Ogopogo in Lake Okanagan in Canada and some of the other ones in the States, because the bodies of water over there are so massive. I would not be surprised at all that there's something weird, wherever it is, Ian, whether it's some kind of weird giant eel or some kind of mammal that's adapted to live in freshwater, or it's some kind of creature that has an ability to be able to, like, you know, as I've said with a few guests, you know, eels can switch between fresh and salt water, you know, so can bull sharks. So it's not like they're talking about something that doesn't happen. It does happen, and it happens with great regularity. Bull sharks are a prime example of an extremely fearsome predator that are quite happy in fresh or salt water, unfortunately for us. So it's interesting that when we look at it now, how the kind of conversation about lake monsters has moved from remnant dinosaurs to undiscovered species of maybe a seal or an eel or some other type of long neck fish or a pinniped that we maybe have never come across. Because at the end of the day, we sometimes think wrongly that especially when it comes to the water and the seas, that we know everything. And you know, it's a cliched fact, but we probably know more about the moon than we do about the bottom of the ocean. And you know, things still turn up in the sea and we're like, what the hell is this? Where's this come from? You know, the megamouth shark is a prime example of, you know, an accidental discovery. Giant squids that have been proved to be of enormous size, and yet they're very rarely seen. It's a whole different world down there. So if anything's going to be discovered, I think it's going to be underneath the waves. I think anything strange, I would not be surprised if something like that gets found or something gets accidentally spotted. So whenever I see these kind of crazy stories from that, I probably look at those with a more balanced eye than any other kind of monster report, Ian, I think, because there's so much potential for an undiscovered underwater creature. And I've done really well there and not mentioned coelacanths, so I'll leave it there.
I like it. That's a perfect time. What we'll do is we'll take a little pause for the cause. We'll take a little break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about my favorite subject for sure. That is the big hairy man in the woods. So we'll take a little break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Dynamos Dozen. Of course, I'm still here with my man, the Mysteries and Monsters guy himself, Paul Bestall, and we were talking about we've obviously been talking about lake monsters and UFOs, but anyone that knows me knows that one of my favorite subjects, because I just find it the most intriguing, is of course Sasquatch and Bigfoot. And that's kind of how I came across your podcast, actually, because, you know, I like listening to different perspectives. And sometimes when you hear some of the I suppose, you know, real life stories of encounters and stuff like that. It's kind of when you hear one or two, you kind of heard them all kind of thing, unless you get one really great one, you know.
Mm.
Kind of like I saw something on the road, but I'm not sure what it was. But you have had some great guests on your show, and obviously got to learn a lot about the subject. So is there any particular ones that kind of stand out to you? Or I suppose let's start off with the famous one, Paddy, of course.
Yes.
Which I really got into, and you know, the more and more I used to be like you, I used to sit on the fence. The more and more I look at that, and you know, the logic behind it, and for the time period, you're like, yes, these guys were out looking for it, but good Lord, when today's technology shows you that this is a creature standing over 8 foot, you know, because they've done the distance and stuff. A great guy is Tinker Tunker on YouTube.
Yes. Yeah, brilliant channel.
He's an amazing mind for it. Somebody we should probably both get on our show at some point. Because he looks at the logic behind it, he measures it up and matches it to something, you know. Now, because so many people have gone out to where Paddy was spotted, we know kind of the scales and whatnot. I mean, if this wasn't the guy that proclaimed that he was in the suit at 5'8", that's for sure.
Bob Hieronymus.
In probably the best non-CGI suit at a time where these guys had fuck all money, let's be real. Talk to me a little bit about that from your perspective.
Well, one of my other great loves is B movies, Ian.
Oh, me too. Dude, you're talking Mr. Horror. Like, I have a horror channel where I just watch B, C, D, and Z list movies.
Oh, you'll do for me then, my friend. I watch many of those, and I'm you know, child of the 80s, so that's, you know, that was my weekends. So I know enough about 50s and 60s monster films to know that that's not a suit, because if it was, it would have been, whoever made that suit would have been made for life. Absolutely would have been set for life. And I think this constant thing of people who say, well, it's a suit, I think they know absolutely nothing about the film industry at that time, because
Mr. Savini would have been out of a job, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, a prime example of that is, obviously, as I say, my love of B movies. Tom Savini's first film as a special effects artist is a film called Octoman.
Yes.
Which was made in 1974.
Yeah.
And if you see that, if you think that's anything other than a rubber suit, you know, 7 years after Patty, with a guy working on a film who's become one of the, you know, the great special effects artists of the modern era.
Yeah.
For somebody else to have been able to allegedly create this wonderful suit 7 years before that. And I've always said as well, you know, the year after Planet of the Apes came out, that was a major motion picture. And, you know, that's clearly Roddy McDowall in a mask, you know? Yeah, there's nothing, you know, amazingly groundbreaking about that. And I know Arthur C. Clarke many years ago once said, well, you know, we did it on 2001 AD. If you look at 2001, and you look at Patty, because I think that's 1968 as well. The monkeys at the beginning of 2001.
It is, yeah.
They're clearly people in suits.
Yeah.
You know, it looks absolutely nothing like it. And once again, you know, that's a Stanley Kubrick picture. That's a film with a big budget, and they can't even come close to what Patterson and Gimlin filmed.
I mean,
you know, like you say,
there's no muscle definition. There's no kind of, you know what I mean? As you say, it's a mask, but when you're talking about the scale here, you're talking about a head. I know they came up with some ridiculous the theories of trying to disprove it actually sound more ridiculous than the ones that don't, because saying, oh, it's a football helmet with a full body suit, fake breasts then hanging down, you know, who taught to make it a woman, you know what I mean?
Well, exactly. That's always been a good point for me, yeah.
But in particular, the way the arms swing in a natural movement, and then the length down to the knee. Again, Tinker Tunker, this is what really made me kind of look at it and go, whoa. But then the way the feet lift, you know, because it's like the thighs are longer, you know, than the calves, which they are on us as well, but they're an extremely long, and it's the way the feet move up in a straight position, you know, and that kind of talks about
It's
that.
the fluidity of it all as well, Ian.
It's just too fluid. It's too fluid.
It can't be, even if it is somebody in a suit, that they would have to be wearing prosthetic enhancements.
Sure.
And there's no way you could walk like that. And at the end of the day as well, the clip is in its essence. I know lots of people have tried to make out that there's other things going on in the background, and I've never really prescribed to any of that.
No, me neither.
It's quite a mundane clip. It's just something walking.
Yeah.
It's not going, it's not running about, it's not throwing stuff at him. It's just something clearly just getting away, looking over its shoulder, and then it's gone. And I remember seeing that when I was like 8 or 9, and that changed my life because that was my first real introduction to Bigfoot, because obviously the only man creature I was aware of was the Yeti. So I was always obsessed with the stories of these strange creatures running about the Himalayas and what was going on there.
And my favorite rendition of it, of course, was the great Hammer horror with
Peter Cushing.
Peter Cushing, yeah.
It's a cracking film. That it still stands up. The Abominable Snowman, brilliant film,
amazing film,
really, and a very interesting take that they're quite kind of sort of psychic, spiritual, and they look a bit like they look more like what you would consider like an elf or a gnome. They just happen to be sort of 9 foot tall.
It was incredible. But I mean, like, talking about stuff then that, people now talk about as being a possible credible thing. Another thing to mention as well, for people that don't really know much about the Patterson Gimlin film, that may have just know what we're talking about. This was 100% in the depths of the woods, like, because people have had to trek big time to get that far in. So like,
Bluff Creek,
like some people have literally got lost there, and to get to that particular spot. So you're talking about lugging all of this equipment as well on horseback.
Yep.
It's you don't rock up in a Honda Civic, you know what I mean?
I mean, it's like, you could kind of draw parallels to what's happened with Ron Moorhead, because Ron's the same where
Let's
his
talk
camp
about
was.
him,
That's in the middle of nowhere. You can only get there on horseback, and then you'll get so near to the camp that you then have to dismount and lead your horses in. So, I mean, I've heard people say that, somebody in that team this is the thing you got to remember, it's 1972, right? So basically, we're expecting somebody's taken a great big lug-in sound recorder or speakers or whatever. We're not talking these days where you can just take an MP3 player in and it can fit in the palm of your hand in. You'd be lugging, you look at what Led Zeppelin used to try and make anybody at the back hear them, never mind.
Absolutely.
Put a speaker in the middle of nowhere.
Unless, a little side note, unless you were Bruce Dickinson and you could have sang without an amplifier. Without a very true. So you never know. I mean, so once again, I think often we look for modern solutions to older problems, and it doesn't stack up. No,
because like you say Bluff Creek now is hard to get to. It's not easy. It's a real trek. And I
think it's like an 8-hour trek or something like that. If even maybe more. I'm not sure. I could be wrong.
And it's one of those things, because I think once again, because we presume that we can get anywhere. You look at, one of my favorite Bigfoot researchers out there is a gentleman called Justin Chernoplesky, who runs Mountain Beast Mysteries.
Oh, yes.
And he does some wonderful documentaries. He's done about 4 or 5. He lives in Canada.
Send me a link to that.
I will.
Please.
I will. It's amazing. He's done I kind of stumbled across him about 4 or 5 years ago. And his first one's called Expedition Sasquatch. And he goes into the wilds of Canada. And even if you are watching it as a lover of Bigfoot, Ian, looking at the scenery and the locations, you just think, well, there's nothing here anywhere around it. So I think often people go, oh, well, it's California. Think, oh, it's California. Oh, well, everything's next to Los Angeles or San Francisco. And it's, California is enormous.
It's huge.
Anyway,
LA is a small city. I mean, you go on Google Maps and you hover over all of it, and you see, literally, you can barely see the shape of the cities compared to the woods that surrounds it.
Yeah. The massive mountain ranges, enormous, hundreds and hundreds of miles of forest. it's not all cities and civilization. You know, you don't have to go far in Cali to be in the wildlife. You know, I mean, this is one of those things that you. And I mean, the other aspect of all this is, you know, if we're expecting that people are running about in the woods in suits, right? Well, there's bears there. So, you know, if I'm anywhere where there's bears in, the last thing I want to be dressed as is a giant ape man with plastic feet on, because there's no, you know, I'm not getting away from a bear without wearing a silly suit. Never mind dressed up as a Bigfoot running about.
Absolutely.
So it's still perplexing, and it's one of those things as well that I think often when people come to the subject, a lot of people tend to use it as a jumping off point to say, oh, well, I think it's fake. I know it's fake. I can see, you know, I've seen people say they can see belts on it. I've seen people say, oh, I can see the zip. I mean, I've watched that film far more than a normal person should have.
Me too. Yeah.
Ian, and there's nothing like that going on. No, you know,
so, I mean, you can see if you really look properly and not just with the naked eye, you can see the ass muscles move. You can see,
of course you
can see muscle movement. I mean, it's the most perplexing suit I've ever seen, and still can't be done today without CGI, if that's the case.
Yeah, I've never seen a Bigfoot film ever where anything comes close to it. Even now, you know.
Yeah. Well,
when you look at things like Willow Creek and exists,
yes,
even, you know.
Yes. So let's talk a little bit about my buddy, and he has become a bit of a friend of mine, Mr. Todd Standen. I'm sure you've seen Discovering Bigfoot. One thing that people need to remember when you go into this, when you're looking at the camera footage, one in particular, you'll actually see like a mosquito going on the nose of one of these, and if you go really closely and zoom in, you'll see it drains like a drop of blood, which makes me go, that's, you know, unless you're a guy in the Canadian wilderness with some amazingly skilled CGI skills to kind of put that together, that's up there. So I think that's why a lot of people aren't kind of sure on Todd Standen, because he's quite an introvert and quite a charismatic guy. But one thing, his credentials are there. He goes hiking into these, he goes deep into these woods and brings people out and guarantees people that you'll see a Sasquatch at some point, and a lot of people say they have with him. So what did you think of some of this honest opinion?
He's the most controversial person in modern Bigfooting.
Yep.
No doubt about it.
50-50 it's split, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I used to think it was all nonsense. And my opinion
Me too.
has changed slightly, primarily because he did, Les Stroud, Survivor Man, did an 8-part series a couple of years ago looking for Bigfoot, and it's brilliant.
I've been looking to see that, actually. Yeah.
I'll send you a link later. I'll put it on this list of stuff I'm going to send you.
My man.
And I was really, because Les is one of those people, you know, he's 100% down the middle.
Legit.
Absolutely. I mean, he's an incredible person with what he can do in the wilderness. You know what I mean? You could drop him anywhere and he'd survive. Yeah. He's working with Todd Standen in this. So at that point, I'm thinking, well, if Les Stroud thinks he's credible, what am I missing?
Yeah.
You know, and I'm not going to sit here in a position and say, well, I can categorically tell you it's nonsense, because at the end of the day, I've never seen one. I can't tell you what they look like.
Me neither.
They might look like that, you know. I think it's one of those things that, as with anything, Ian, there have been notable people over the years. Paul Freeman is probably a really good older example of this. Now, Paul Freeman was a guy who had an experience, I think, late 70s, and it changed his life. But he then became one of those people that whenever he took a camera out with him, he'd catch footage. He would always find footprints. He could guarantee you Bigfoot all the time. And if you go on YouTube and you can see some of Paul Freeman's footage from the 90s, the sort of
add that to the list.
Yeah, the birth of the portable video camera that didn't weigh a ton, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Freeman was very similar in the way that he was viewed, that some people thought he was the messiah in the world of Bigfoot, and a lot of people thought it was all fakery and nonsense. But there is this other aspect of Freeman that, I mean, I've spoken to some of the most notable modern cryptozoologists. A lot of people believe that Freeman did have these experiences when he first started, but became so frustrated that he couldn't prove to people what he'd seen was real.
Yeah.
He decided to perform what had happened. And as you know, as you will discover, the more you get into Bigfooting, the more characters pop up. Ivan Marks is another one who originally started as a a dyed in the wool investigator and went all the way into full on hoaxery. So it's very interesting because you can mention Todd's name and it will instantly give you an indication of a person's belief in him and his alleged evidence. Because I mean, some of it, I'm like, really? I mean, but I suppose that's the thing. Like I say, I'm not wanting to sit on the fence. I've seen a lot of it I'm not convinced with. However, I've seen enough that makes me think, I think there's more to this than meets the eye.
Yeah, I mean, he tells a great story of obviously an Irish girl, getting picked up by the kind of really gnarly looking guy you see at the end, kind of creeping out.
Yeah.
And she sounds like a very, very credible, source. So that's kind of, I'm the same. And like I say, you look at something like a mosquito taking blood out of this supposed mask, and you're going, well, this, like, come on, you got to give me something better to debunk that than it's a guy in a mask. And listen, I've seen the kind of the Google images of like people meshing Todd Standing's face into the. I mean, that looks like a crock of shit to me, And again, Tinker Tunker, the guy that I really do believe is credible at putting this stuff together, has said, well, this has got to be one huge mask, and automatically he debunked it, saying that it was Todd Standing because the width of the face would have been way too wide for the eyes to match up. Little things that we don't think of. And if you look at he calls him Jake, the really hairy looking guy.
Yeah. Yes.
That is eerily looks like Paddy if you kind of put the two of them close together. Do you know what I mean? The kind of similar kind of face, the way it's eerily like Paddy. So we're gonna have a part 2 and 3 with Todd on this as well. And I plan to go to Calgary when all this dies down as well. Myself and my better half will be we'll be putting it to the test, basically. I better get in shape for it though. That guy likes picking up Irish people. I'm in trouble.
I think it's one of those things here. At the end of the day, I mean, he might have got the best evidence ever, and people just, as with anything, one of the biggest problems about this is, I mean, I've got to know a lot of people who like to work in a collaborative manner. The guys at the Olympic Project and Project Zoo Book, who seem to be just pulling everybody of a real, level of scientific endeavor together to prove what's going on. And it may be the fact that, for some people, it's too much about the person rather than the actual phenomenon.
There you go.
And then that's not what we're here to discuss. We're discussing the evidence, not the personality. And I think, and he's not the only person that wants to prove the existence of Bigfoot. There are hundreds of people that want to be that person. And you could say that about anything in the world of the weird, be it UFOs, ghosts, poltergeists, Nessie. There's always somebody who wants to be that person. And if not, then why are you searching for it? You're not doing it for the good of mankind. With the greatest respect, if you can prove any of those phenomena without a shadow of a doubt, you have made yourself a millionaire overnight. Easy peasy.
Oh, and that's a given. You know what I mean? That is a given. That's why you go on shows. You and me would jump at the opportunity. Let's be real. You know what I mean? If we thought we'd be that guy. Let's talk a little bit about, I know Ron Moorhead is obviously a mutual friend now, and we've, one of the things that he talked about on the great podcast as well that I don't mind plugging, Sasquatch Chronicles.
Yeah.
Wes has some great guests on. He's obviously big time now at this stage, so much so that you never write back, Wes, but calling you out, motherfucker. No, I'm kidding, of course. But Wes has some great guys, and one of the great stories that Ron Moorhead was particularly intrigued by was the English lady that was over there on the beach which are you familiar with the story?
I'm not aware of this story at all.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, Ron brought it to my attention, and it was funny. I'd actually been listening to that episode about a week or two beforehand. It was an English lady over on holidays, I believe it was in California. She was on the beach, kind of, they were in the woods, they were trekking, but
Yeah.
she picked up her camera to take photos. She was just sitting on the beach and basically looked up and saw two or three of these creatures, basically. And it was more of a lake, I believe, like a lake beach rather than than an actual beach. It wasn't like people assume that you're talking about Venice Beach here or something, like you said.
Yeah.
The Americans call these beaches. I don't tend to call them beaches. I'm just like, it's a lake.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, there's sand and all, but it's still a lake. So apparently she saw this, but this thing started acting really aggressive with her. She dropped her camera, absolutely fearing for her life. Anyone that listens to the intro of Wes's Sasquatch Chronicles will hear this lady talking and the actual genuine fear in her voice and what she's describing. And apparently they were making that sound that Ron Moorhead, of course, got on audio. And they were arguing with each other. And apparently this thing was, in full exposure. I mean, they don't wear clothes,
No.
And this male apparently was really, had eyes, directed at this woman and wanted to make her fearful. But it's a really, really interesting, really interesting story. I'd encourage anyone to go and check it out. I don't know the lady's name. I know Ron wants to do something with her, and get her story out there. But so many of these encounters, isn't there, that you kind of go, wow, this is, these people can't all be lying and be great actors.
Well, this is one of the aspects of it all, Ian, that I've often considered, that let's pretend that everybody is making it up, right?
Let's be cynical.
What on earth is going on? Because, this isn't something that's happening in California. It's going on in Montana, in Nebraska, in Missouri, in Massachusetts, New England, New Hampshire, New York State, Arkansas, Arizona. This is happening all across, British Columbia, Ottawa. It's occurring all across Alberta, North America. Yeah. So if people are not seeing, misidentifying things, then what on earth is going on? Because even if you look at it really cynically, that's a really culturally interesting aspect of it, because something must be going on. And if that's the case, then what on earth is that about? Because even if it isn't all true, which, as I said, I do have moments of doubt, but I am a dyed-in-the-wool believer. I think, as with anything in the modern era, I think there's a lot of nonsense out there. Sadly, but there is with any kind of weird phenomenon. Doesn't matter what we're talking about. Bigfoot is what we're talking about now. But like you say, when I hear a witness talking about their experience and they have an extreme emotional response to it, that gives it a different level. And I've often said on my show when I've interviewed people, my favorite witnesses are the experienced outdoorsmen and women who go out there, have grown up in the woods, rural locations, 40 miles from anywhere, live off the land. They have an experience. They'll never go in the woods again. Or they change their hunting. They don't go in alone anymore, or they stop going to a specific location because something has happened to them that has had such an emotional response in them that they cannot get past that. And I often say it's clearly some form of PTSD, that these people have been so traumatized, primarily because, you're looking at an 8-foot biped, but I think you're also looking at something that the vast majority of normal people in the world tell you cannot and does not exist. But if you see it, then you know that everything anybody tells you is wrong.
Yeah. And that's happened so many times over the course of history, right? You know what I mean? It's like somebody who's gone through some sort of major trauma that, like, oh, well, bad people don't exist, but you tell that to somebody who's been hurt, by somebody, it very much exists. You know, I know it's probably a bad example, but you cannot tell somebody that has lived through an experience that, oh, you'll be okay, you know, get over it, or get over it. That's the best one.
Yeah.
Like it's physically impossible.
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely.
I suppose we close out. Do you have any favorite Bigfoot story that people may or may not know about, or anything?
Well, I kind of discovered this one by accident. There's a brilliant book that's just been re-released, which was kind of lost from the 1970s, and the title escapes me now. It's something to do with the prairie. Mystery on the Prairie. It's by a police officer called Keith Wolverton. Anyway, and it's basically, is it Mystery on the Prairie? It'll come to me anyway. He was basically involved in a spate of cattle mutilations that were going off in Montana in the 1970s, and ended up setting up a task force. But as this strange situation was developing, he started to get reports of Bigfoot turning up. And one of the strangest Bigfoot stories I've ever heard was two girls were outside of a farm in Montana, and it was at night, and they were outside playing, and they saw this silhouette of this.
So they're kids.
Yeah, like 12, 13 teenagers.
Sure. Yeah.
Hope you, as it will become self-explanatory, you would hope anyway. I'm sure they're like early teens. Anyway, So they see this hulking figure, and it starts to come towards them, and they realize it's what they describe as a 7.5 foot hairy biped creature. So one of the girls, I think she either had a gun or she runs into the house to get a gun and fires at it as a warning shot. And the creature theatrically throws itself to the floor and starts to crawl, going like that along, and then it just pulls itself back up, and the girls just go, oh, turn tail and run off.
Holy shit.
Mystery Stalks the Prairie. That's what it's called. Keith Wolverton. So it's a book that I've been told about because, like I say, he started off investigating cattle mutilations in Montana as a sheriff as well. You know, he's not just a normal copper, and he got set up with a proper task force, and they were finding real evidence that something odd was going on. And then all these Bigfoot stories started coming in as well. Brilliant.
There's like UFOs, it's kind of, there's too many stories, isn't there, worldwide, to kind of just put it down as, you know, in people's heads, you know what I mean?
Yeah. It's the same with the Yowie in Australia, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, the Yowie is one of my favorite cryptids anyway. I love him.
Not something I'm familiar with either. So again, add it to the list. It's I love
rabbit
holes. I love it.
Yeah. There's I'll send you a link. There's a brilliant channel. The key Yowie researcher in the world's a gentleman called Dean Harrison, who's been out there for 30 years, and he was I think he's from Queensland originally in Australia. Was out walking, backpacking, having a nice day. Had a terrifying encounter, changed his life. He spent the best part of 30 years trying to prove that they're real.
Wow.
So the Yowies are very interesting anyway, but I'll add that to the list of things to keep you up at night, my friend.
For sure, and that's what I like. Well, look, I think that's about all we have time for today. Paul, I'd love you to come back on at some point.
I'd be happy to do so. Thank you.
So many things we could talk about, to be fair. But before we go, I always like to hand the floor to my guests and tell people where they can find you and what you've got going on. Plug whatever you need to plug, my friend.
Thank you. Well, you can find me on wherever you find podcasts. Just look for Mysteries and Monsters. The website is mysteriesandmonsters.com. You can find links to the show there. You can also find Mysteries and Monsters across all social media platforms. I've decided to try and fit as many episodes as I could into October, Ian. So I'm back to normal of one a week from November onwards, but I've got some brilliant guests returning. I've got Paul Sinclair is returning to join me on my 150th episode, because I was fortunate enough to spend my birthday UFO spotting with him this year. So that was nice out on the East Coast. David Weatherly's back. Unfortunately, we didn't. I was gutted. But typically somebody else went the week after and they filmed something. But I mean, it was just nice to be there and be where all this weird stuff goes off, you know?
Yeah.
So showed us a few things and showed us their kit and pointed out why, it's not just lights and it's not just ships and it's not lighthouses. So it was very interesting.
Awesome.
Got him. David Weatherly's coming back. I've got an episode coming up about Champ. Chad Lewis is coming back talking about strange lumberjack legends of the 19th century, featuring some weird creatures such as the jackalope and stuff. And we've hopefully got another Roswell episode coming up down the line as well. So something for everybody, I hope.
Absolutely. And of course, you got a Patreon channel as well.
Yeah. You can support the show on Patreon. You get early episode releases. They're all ad-free as well. And now I've got through working through everything and moving house. There will also be exclusive Patreon bonus episodes looking at some strange paranormal archive reports from newspapers going back 200 years.
Awesome. Listen, you're a gentleman. It's been an absolute pleasure. As I said, for sure, we'll have you on again. And I do implore anybody that has enjoyed today's show to go and check out Mysteries and Monsters, as I said, anywhere that you listen to your favorite podcasts. And until next time, Paul, been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for your time and all the very best to you and your listeners. It's been a real pleasure. So once again, thank you very much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed myself.
And same to you, sir.